Hi everyone, just quickly before I get into this video, there's a few things I want to explain about this channel. Firstly, one of my main aims is to be making high quality, well researched academic content above all else. I've just graduated from university and got my degree, and I still have a strong desire to keep making new research, but in a new way. So for as long as I'm making videos on this channel, which entirely depends on how well this is received, I'll make sure all my work will be fully sourced with references in the description below. This is so I know that anyone who disagrees with me, or wants to check anything I have to say, will be able to see exactly where I'm getting all my research from, just as you would in a traditional research paper. Also, many, but not all, of the content I'm likely to cover here is some of the slightly more niche topics. So, for example, it's not currently particularly high on my priority list to be talking about World War II or the Cold War as a whole. But if there ever ends up being any great demand, that might change. The first topic I'm covering is one that's actually important to me. The August coup was my topic of choice for my recent dissertation and has been the initial motivation for me starting this channel. Having spent over 9 months researching and writing it, I feel that it warrants sharing with the world, albeit in an altered format. So, having repurposed the paper from a traditional essay into a video essay, I like to believe there is nowhere else on this platform that you can find a more in-depth coverage of the topic. In line with the structure of the paper, these video essays will be split into 4 separate uploads, each covering my different chapters on the topic. The first video you're watching here, as suggested in the title, is focusing on analysing and discussing all the factors that led to the attempted 1991 Soviet coup d'etat. What I won't be doing in this series is a simple recap or overview of the context, so if you need any help knowing names such as Gorbachev or Yeltsin, I recommend quickly going and watching a recap elsewhere before coming back here. With that all said then, I'm going to stop talking now and we can head into the video. Chapter 1. The Road to the Coup. Soon, there will be change for the better. This was the telegram that Soviet Vice President Gennady Guneev sent to Cuban dictator Fidel Castro in July 1991. Just 1 month later, and the State Committee on the State of Emergency, consisting of 8 members including Guneev, placed President Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest at his Dacha in Crimea and seized power. This telegram was a message of intent to the nervous Castro, who had a difficult relationship with Gorbachev because of his policies designed at distancing the two countries by cutting Soviet financial support to the island. Since as early as 1990, hardliners in the CPSU and KGB had been privately discussing the possibility of seizing power from Gorbachev if they couldn't convince him to reverse some of his reforms. For a long while, they had been growing frustrated at Gorbachev for many reasons. For example, they felt as though they had been playing nice with the USA far too much. They blamed him and his policies for losing control of the country and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Berlin Wall in Eastern Europe. On top of this, nationalist leaders in each of the 15 republics were growing in influence and threatening the very existence of the Soviet Union. Independence movements in the Baltic states had been repeatedly failed to be crushed. What all these factors have in common is that they compounded to solidify the belief these hardliners had that Gorbachev was not fit for leadership anymore. Therefore, just days before the new Union Treaty was to be signed, they decided to step in and halt the reforms whilst they still could. Firstly then, to understand the background of the August coup, we need to talk about this new Union Treaty. By late 1990, Gorbachev had begun to realise that the USSR was not in a good place. It was on the verge of completely collapsing and needed a complete restructure to save it. So, after some initial hesitation, the president began to work on a treaty which would transform the USSR into a confederation of sovereign republics, unified by a common president, armed forces and currency. Not dissimilar to the 1997 devolution in the UK, the individual republics would have their own elected leaders and would be self-governing on internal matters. Importantly, each of these republics would be fully democratic and willing participants. For Gorbachev to be able to claim this legitimacy, he held a referendum on March 17, 1991. As expected, the 6 republics of Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia all boycotted the referendum and continued their push for full independence. However, in the remaining 9, a majority was passed, and so Gorbachev pushed on with the will of the people. During these negotiations, there were fierce disagreements between Boris Yeltsin, the President of the Russian Republic, and Gorbachev. These largely related to issues over whether the individual republics would be able to set their own tax rates. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and it was agreed that cross-union taxes could only be made in consultation with all of the individual republics' leaders. In 1995, Gorbachev claimed in his memoir that while nothing technically stood in the way of the treaty being signed, assaults from the left and the right gained momentum as the date drew nearer. Again, while the treaty had the official backing of the citizens in the remaining 9 republics, it was clear that there was significant apprehension from the politicians. A sense of cold feet began to grow as the date drew nearer. Gorbachev later recalled a phone call he had with Yeltsin in early August, where he said, "I could not get rid of the feeling that Yeltsin was holding something back." It turned out that Yeltsin had actually been under significant pressure from his own camp to withdraw support for the deal. Equally, attacks from the Conservatives also grew more powerful. This was because many of them knew that they would be losing their lucrative positions upon its signing. Because of this, it strongly suspected that the timing of the coup was influenced by the proposed date for the treaty's signing, forcing the hardliners to act quickly. Furthermore, there was also the previously mentioned rise in nationalism, which had been gathering momentum since the 1980s. One figure that represented this was Boris Yeltsin. Having been a member of the CPSU since the 1960s, by the late 1980s he began to be the leading voice of opposition to Gorbachev, arguing his reforms were not strong enough or fast enough. After he controversially resigned from the Communist Party in 1990, by July of 1991 he became the first democratically elected president of Russia. From the moment Yeltsin won this election, decisively beating Gorbachev's preferred candidate, it's worth mentioning, a power struggle began between the two. Their passionate dislike of one another made compromises difficult and therefore passing of reforms less likely. However, beginning circa 1987, Yeltsin also made himself the enemy of the hardliners in the party. Having been described as a man who had little patience for negotiations and preferred brinkmanship, he was simultaneously feared and despised of by those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Moreover, because of difficulties in dealing with Yeltsin, a situation dubbed the War of Laws began to develop. This was where reforms and new laws, from both sides, were continuously being blocked by the other, creating a sort of gridlock. This was because of the situation which had slowly been developing, where opposing sides both had great power and influence. Gorbachev's eventual solution to this was the previously mentioned New Union Treaty, a compromise giving the republics more autonomy in exchange for their cooperation and therefore increased stability. Now, it's also important to quickly look at the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia and how their independence movements were a driving force behind the August coup. Lithuania was the first of the 3 to declare their independence, doing so in March of 1990. For years, Gorbachev had been attacking pro-independence figures, such as the Lithuanian Landsbergis, for example. This had the effect of making Gorbachev less and less popular with the people, while also making cult figures of those advocates. However, as you will notice as a recurring theme, Gorbachev found himself isolated as the hardliners in the party also attacked him for not going far enough and crushing the protests. The hardliners' frustration can be shown in two notable examples. Firstly, the massacre in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius, where 14 civilians were killed by Soviet soldiers in January 1991. Then also when Soviet troops attacked in the Latvian capital of Riga, later that same month, killing a further 5. While the facts are still a point of contention, Gorbachev personally claimed he had no prior knowledge of the planning of these massacres. He claimed that hardliners within the armed forces, such as the defense minister, Dmitry Yazov, had given the orders without his permission. Now, whether Gorbachev was being truthful about his knowing or not, it still shows us how the Baltic independence question plays into the tensions between the hardliners and the president at the time. Now, it's also important to understand that by the beginning of the 1990s, after half a decade of drastic reform and change under Gorbachev, the hardliners had started to become increasingly bold in their resistance. The political scientist Jerry Hugh later stated that those of us who thought that the traditional hardliners were too weak to stage a coup were surprised that they dared. What was clear, though, was that by 1991, many within the CPSU had finally lost any respect that they may have once had for Gorbachev, and they began to gradually undermine him more and more through actions like the previously mentioned massacres in the Baltic states. Another example would be in August 1990, when Gorbachev presented his 500 days market liberalization plan. The aim of this was to remove some of the strongest state controls on the economy, with the intention of improving output. The Conservatives, however, continuously denounced his plans during Politburo meetings, eventually forcing him into backing away from their plan altogether. Additionally, Conservatives like Gennady Zyuganov repeatedly attacked the president's few close allies, such as Alexander Yakovlev, further undermining his reform process. In July 1991, this anger all culminated in the Sovetskaya Rossiya publication, A Word to the People, which many high-ranking generals and politicians signed off on. Of those that gave their signature to the piece include the previously mentioned Zyuganov, as well as General Valentin Varenikov and politician Alexander Tizyakov, among others. These latter two are noteworthy, as they were later members of the Gang of Eight, which staged the coup. The publication has been described as a blatant call for a coup, and it heavily criticised Gorbachev and the state of the country. To give a short extract, how is it that we have let people come to power who do not love this country? That is just one example of the sort of language seen in the publication. The contemporary journalist Natalia Ivanova made the observation that the sort of language and reasoning used in this matches perfectly the justifications used on the first morning of the coup. And that is why this is such an important and symbolic moment, as it can be seen as a clear foreshadowing of what was to come. It's important to remember that by the time this publication was signed off on, in July 1991, planning for the coup was already well underway, and this was the same month that Vice President Guneev sent the previously mentioned telegram to Castro. A Word to the People is also a fine example of the Conservatives in the party justifying their anger as being patriotic above all else, an idea that Gorbachev later labelled sheer demagoguery. However, in this period, it wasn't just the Conservative politicians who were losing patience with President Gorbachev. The infamous KGB, and specifically its head, Vladimir Kryuchkov, had been growing increasingly anxious at the results of Gorbachev's reforms for a number of years by this point. In a private conversation with the former US President Richard Nixon in early 1991, Kryuchkov is quoted to have said to him, "We have had about as much democracy as we can stomach." While not the obvious face of it, it's apparent that behind the scenes, Kryuchkov and the KGB were key driving forces behind the coup. He was one of the strongest opponents of Gorbachev's reforms, consistently making moves to undermine the president. In private spaces, Kryuchkov is quoted to have repeatedly made the remark that Gorbachev is not reacting adequately to events. On top of this, as per later revealed documents, it appears that Kryuchkov first began to draw up plans for a coup in November of 1990. As well as this, Kryuchkov had also begun to take many of the Soviet foreign policy issues into his own hands, undermining Gorbachev's efforts. In June 1990, he flew to Cuba for a secret meeting with Fidel Castro, independently agreeing with him that the USSR would reverse its planned aid cuts and Cuba would remain within the Soviet sphere of influence once Gorbachev had been removed from power. As of late 1990, along with drawing up plans for the coup, Kryuchkov also had Gorbachev and anyone connected to him's phone lines tapped. The American ambassador to the USSR, Jack Matlock Jr., also added in his book, Autopsy on an Empire, that through this, Kryuchkov had become aware of plans Gorbachev had to replace him. This is supported by the fact that a transcript of Gorbachev's conversation where he planned to replace Kryuchkov was later found on the desk of Valery Boldin, a fellow conspirator, suggesting that clearly they had access to the president's private conversations. This knowledge that he was soon to be replaced is also likely another reason why Kryuchkov and his allies rushed into staging the coup so soon. As well as KGB involvement, there was also the small matter of the Soviet armed forces. John Leppingwell made the point that the August coup marked the breaking point of a long tradition of the Soviet armed forces not getting involved in domestic politics. For context, during the Brezhnev era, from 1964 until 1982, the Soviet military enjoyed extensive freedom and had a large say in their own decision-making processes. However, under Gorbachev's extensive package of reforms, the military's professional autonomy came under threat. This was because of civilian roles, such as that of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which increasingly took the lead in Soviet security policy. Furthermore, for the majority of Gorbachev's tenure, the man who held the position of Ministry of Foreign Affairs was his close ally, Eduard Shevardnadze. Shevardnadze pushed for arms limitations, which angered the military and conservative politicians alike, eventually becoming so strong that they forced his resignation from the position in 1990. To put it simply, the more Gorbachev and his allies' policies stripped away the military's freedom, the more it pushed back against Gorbachev. This resentment towards Gorbachev from the military was decisive in the active role it played during the coup, shown by the presence of tanks on the streets of Moscow on August 19th. Now, despite so far mainly focusing on external factors, we're going to look at some of the individual impacts Gorbachev had personally, i.e., what did he actually do to fuel this desire for a coup? As I mentioned earlier, from the perspective of the hardliners in the CPSU, the KGB, and the military, Gorbachev was actively destroying the Union through his policies, and also all of their power that came with it in the process. But, as well as this, it's also what many of his actions represented that angered these conservatives so much. For example, in 1988, in a context where the Baltic states' calls for independence were getting louder and louder, Gorbachev personally encouraged the publication of Dmitry Volkogonov's biography of Stalin. This biography was significant because it became the first objective piece on Stalin to be published in the Soviet Union. In it, it wrote critically of Stalin's annexation of the Baltic states during the Second World War. Now, this obviously frustrated the conservatives because they felt that the official state resources, which were being used in the writing of this book, should be used to their benefit, not to encourage the legitimacy of the Baltic's independence movements. And while this is just one example, it helps us to paint a picture of how all these minor missteps added up to create this desire to have Gorbachev removed from power. Now, another point of contention between Gorbachev and the hardliners was the way in which he handled the West, and the USA more specifically. As a collective, the hardliners believed the USA represented the moral enemy of the Soviet Union, and that the president's foreign policies were far too friendly. Gorbachev generally practiced a policy of greater cooperation with the West, leading to easing tensions in the late 1980s. Beth Fisher made the assertion that under Gorbachev, dialogue between the major powers became institutionalized, with meetings between the leaders becoming a regular occurrence. However, to the conservatives, this strong emphasis on cooperation with the US, while simultaneously allowing the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, was a sign of weakness and would see them becoming subservient to the US. For example, one bitter CPSU member told Washington Post correspondent David Remnick in late 1991, "Never did de Gaulle bend low before Hitler the way Gorbachev did to the West." This clearly shows us the kind of Cold War era mentality that many within the party still had in 1991. Now, moving on from that point, many have also argued that it was not only the president's policies that paved the way for the coup, but that he also acted naively in his approach and that he should have foreseen the threat that the hardliners posed. Firstly, it's important that I quickly just point out that Gorbachev's personal account, which I've largely drawn from his memoir, differs greatly in areas to the narrative offered from others. Here in the West, because of his pro-friendly democracy policies, he is generally well regarded. On the other hand, in Russia, specifically in the direct aftermath of the USSR collapsing in the 1990s, Gorbachev was scapegoated there and largely blamed. For these reasons, it's likely that Gorbachev often exaggerates his stories in an attempt to balance out public perception in his favour. This is just something that's worth keeping in mind when discussing information taken from his memoir. Anyway, Gorbachev stated that, in the months leading up to the coup, he hadn't ruled out the possibility of a head-on clash between forces, such as a civil war, for example. He also stated that while vacationing in Crimea in the days before his house arrest, that I had a strong feeling that I should return to Moscow quickly. Now, what these two extracts possibly suggest to us is that he's trying to set his own narrative that he was indeed aware of the oncoming threat, and the idea that he was naive is untrue. However, this narrative is often not supported by other accounts. For example, it's likely that Gorbachev was privy to the fact that a coup was being planned against him, and his decision not to act has been the point of much debate. The best solution we have, then, is to simply work with the resources available. During a meeting with Kazakh President Nazarbayev and Yeltsin, the latter warned him that KGB Chief Kryuchkov and Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov were, and I quote, clearly against the treaty. He further added that Soviet Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov and Gorbachev's longtime friend Anatoly Lukyanov were also resistors. Yeltsin also warned Gorbachev that he was, quote, surrounded by reactionaries who could eventually betray him. Gorbachev supposedly laughed off these comments from Yeltsin, replying, Lukyanov, Kryuchkov and the rest are not as bad as you think. From this specific example, then, it's reasonable to come to the conclusion that the president did in fact act regrettably or naive. Had he taken on board Yeltsin's advice, the coup may have been avoided. In Gorbachev's defense, though, it's important to remember that at the time, Yeltsin was his political rival, and it's understandable that he may have been skeptical of his advice for that reason. However, Gorbachev's close ally, Alexander Yakovlev, and 21 other reformists met in a closed session shortly before the coup, unanimously agreeing that a right-wing coup was imminent. Gorbachev's close ally and the former foreign minister, Shevardnadze, later stated, quote, I reprove the president, because he could have come to the same conclusion and the coup would have been prevented. Overall, then, the coup clearly had a variety of elements at play, which led us down the timeline that we went. Because of all these different reasons, it would be reductive to simply argue that one specific ingredient was the sole driving force. However, with that said, the naivety of Gorbachev in believing he could appease both the hardliners on the right and left, and that neither would look to seize power from him, was definitely a drastic error. As Shevardnadze stated, had the president taken heed of the warning signs on show, such as the "A Word to the People" publication, the coup might very well have been halted before it could begin. Okay everyone, that's it for today. I really hope that you've enjoyed this instalment, and thank you to everyone who's made it to the end. The next upload in this 4-part series will be 3 Days in Foros, focusing on exactly what happened during the August coup and those 3 days that Mikhail Gorbachev was held prisoner in his dacha. I hope to have this next part posted in about a week's time, so remember to check back in here then for that. Again, thank you for watching, I've been Sam, and I'll see you later.